According to ancient Egyptian mythology, the god Osiris was hacked to death by his brother Seth, who then scattered his body parts across the land. Osiris' wife, and also sister, Isis, was able to recover the pieces, put them back together, and resurrect him. Except there was one piece he wasn't able to find. His penis. That had been eaten by a fish known to the ancient Egyptians as the Medjed. According to the Medjedian mythology, eating the divine phallus gifted that fish with intelligence and the knowledge of magic and language, lifting him above the other fish and beasts of the Nile. They believe that this fish was the first Medjed from whom they all descend. Could this overlap in mythology be more than a mere coincidence, like mainstream archaeologists argue? Does it perhaps suggest that the two are based on the same true story? Or that the ancient Egyptians were themselves gifted with advanced technology allowing them to talk with fish? Ancient ichthyology theorists say fish, and believe that the evidence may be found within one of the very gifts that the Medjed received, their language. Medjedic is a language in the Middle Mormyrian family. It's spoken almost exclusively in the parts of the Nile near the modern city of El-Banasa, once the site of the ancient Egyptian settlement of Per-Medjed, where the Medjed fish was worshipped. Its speakers are the Medjedian people, named after their supposed ancestor. They are members of the species swafish, scientific name Oxyrhynchus swai, an unusually intelligent Mormyrid. This is a presentation about their language. Before we can talk about them and said language, we need to talk about Mormyrids, because I'm pretty sure most of you are currently asking what on earth that is. Well, it's these guys and gals. Mormyrids are the members of the Mormyridae family of fishes, native to waterways across much of Africa, including the Nile. They're also sometimes known as elephant fish, because, well, look at them. The size and appearance vary a fair bit between species, with lengths anywhere from 5 centimeters up to 1.5 meters. What groups them together is a collection of weird traits, most of which aren't really relevant to talking about Medjedic. I will mostly stick to talking about the ones that are. Mormyrids live in habitats with poor visibility. One of the weird traits that they evolved to do so is that they're electric. Yes, like an electric eel, but also not like them. Electric eels are what's known as strongly electric, meaning their saps have enough juice to stun and harm. Mormyrids are weakly electric. Their electric organ discharges, or EODs, maxing out at a few volts at most. Not enough to sap anything, but still useful for navigating and communicating in dark and murky water. As the name suggests, EODs are produced by the electric organ. Like in the case of almost all electric fishes, in Mormyrids, this organ evolved from muscle tissue. In their case, muscles in their tail. Muscle cells are actually already electric. In fact, pretty much all cells are. All the fish's cells, and your cells, maintain a voltage difference across their cell membranes by moving ions in and out of it. Some cells, like nerve and muscle cells, are set up in a way that allows them to have rapid changes in the voltage called action potentials. That's what the electrical signals in nerve cells are. In muscle cells, they're used to signal and coordinate contractions. In the electric organ, the muscle cells evolved into electrocytes, little disc-shaped cells that form long stacks connected in series. They lost the ability to contract and instead became optimized for generating action potentials and for firing them in sync. Because of this setup, when they do fire, all the tiny voltages of the action potentials of all the individual cells sum up to a still small but meaningful voltage. Importantly, the signal this generates doesn't propagate outwards as electromagnetic waves. It creates an electrostatic field around the fish, with current flowing through the water between the head and tail of the fish. Because all the cells have been synced up to discharge at once, there's no way to vary the discharge. The shape of the EOD is determined by the physiology of the electric organ and the ion channel proteins of the electrocytes. EODs are said to be stereotyped. They basically always look the same for a given individual, only changing slowly over time with things like age, sex, and hormonal influences. It also means that their shape are in large part determined by genetics, and so can be acted on by evolution. As a result, it can vary a lot between species, with different lengths and number of phases. Although long in this context is still only like 20 milliseconds. For our friends the Medjed, their EODs are around 0.8 milliseconds long and look like this. Before we talk about how EODs are sensed and used, a quick note on another important distinction between types of electric fishes. There are two types, pulse and wave. In wave-type species, like South American knife fishes, the time between discharges is about the same duration as the discharges themselves, resulting in a continuous quasi-sinusoidal signal, aka like a wave. Mormyrids are pulse type. Their interdischarge interval, or IDI, is much longer than the duration of the discharge itself. Sap, long pause, sap, long pause, sap, long pause, and so on. Okay, so how do you sense electricity? Well, if you're a Mormyrid, you do it with your 3 different types of electroreceptors. These are tiny organs embedded within the skin across much of the fish's body. And when I say tiny, I mean that diagrams of them show individual cells. The first type is the ampullae of Lorenzini. You might have heard the name before in relation to sharks. This is the most basic and primitive type, and not super relevant to us. They're used for passive electrolocation of weak, low-frequency fields, like those generated by the muscles of other animals. The second and third type are Mormyrimasts and Knollen organs, both of which have evolved to detect high-frequency signals like those found in EODs. Mormyrimasts are used for active electrolocation. When a fish fires its electric organ and makes an EOD, the electric field around it is distorted by objects in the water. The Mormyrimasts in the skin of the fish detect these distortions, creating a sort of electrical image of its surroundings on its body. How and by how much the currents are distorted by objects depends on how electrically conductive those objects are. Objects that are more conductive than the water focuses the current, increasing the amplitude and changing the waveform. Objects that are less conductive than the water causes a decrease in the amplitude, but keep the waveform the same. That also means that objects that have the same conductivity as water are essentially invisible. Mormyrimasts are distributed across the back and belly of the fish, and are especially concentrated in the head region. Some species even have one or more fovea, where they're especially dense. In species with the admittedly goofy-looking chin appendage, called the schnauzen organ, there's often a fovea near its tip, which makes sense because it's used to probe the environment and search for small invertebrates to eat. Knollen organs are used for electrocommunication. Unlike Mormyrimasts, which will respond more strongly to higher amplitude signals, Knollen organs respond the same regardless of the amplitude, and they only respond once to the same signal. They're also just more sensitive and will respond to a wider range of frequencies. Perfect for detecting the EODs of other fish and the time between them. See, since there's no way to vary the waveform or amplitude of the EOD, all the information has to be encoded in the IDIs, i.e. the length of the pauses between them. We'll get into how the communication part works once we actually start talking about the language. One thing that's worth mentioning is that the range of electrolocation and electrocommunication are both kind of short by our standards. Electrocommunication is typically only really possible between fish up to around a meter apart. Electrolocation is even more short-ranged, really only being useful within one body length, which, for the swordfish, is around 20 to 25 centimeters. Speaking of swordfish, they belong to the Mormyrinae subfamily, specifically to the uncreatively named clade A. Clade is just a fancy biology word for a group of organisms with a shared common ancestor. This is important because in species within this clade, a certain part of the brain called the exterior-lateral nucleus has evolved increased size and complexity. This is one of the brain regions involved in processing electrocommunication signals. The extra brain power allows members of clade A, like the Medjed, to extract not only the time between EODs, but by comparing the signals from Knollen organs on different sides of the body, they can also extract the waveform itself. This allows them to access the information encoded in it about the identity, age, and sex of other fish. They're basically real-life Pokemon, always saying their own name. Staying on the topic of fish brains, while the swarfish has obviously evolved certain brain traits to have human-level intelligence, much of the hardware in its head is still very much like that of its relatives. Mormyrids communicate using sequences of pulse intervals, or SPICE for short. These are, well, sequences of pulse intervals, set patterns of IDIs that communicate the behavioral state or intent of the fish. Pauses, long stretches with a higher frequency called regularizations, briefer bursts of various lengths, and more complex patterns like scallops and rasps. All of these are achieved with a fairly simple setup. The signal to the electric organ to fire is ultimately given by the command nucleus in the fish's brain, which is connected to two other parts of the brain called the precommand nucleus, PCN, and the dorsal posterior nucleus, DP, which are both connected to the ventral-posterior nucleus, or VPD. A signal from the DP results in an acceleration, a burst of shorter IDIs, while a signal from the PCN results in a scallop, a sudden very brief drop to very short IDIs. A signal from both results in a rasp, a combination of the two, with a brief drop to scallop length IDIs followed by a longer period of acceleration length IDIs. The VPD inhibits the DP and PCN, which is how you get pauses called cessations. Signals from other parts of the brain to the VPD and to the PCN and DP allows for regulation of the base rest IDI duration. One of the major evolutionary innovations that allows swarfish to have a full-on language was more precise and conscious control over this EOD generating brain machinery. Medjedic's phonemes are all single individual EODs and some amount of time preceding it. In other words, the only contrast in the language is phonemic length, and the part that gets lengthened is the silence. There are two types of phonemes, depending on what the length is relative to: Idios and echoes. In idiophonemes, derived from the Greek prefix idio, meaning one's own, the length of the phoneme is the IDI, i.e. it's relative to the speaker's own previous discharge. In Medjedic, the durations typically used in speech are between 9 to around 85-ish milliseconds. That lower limit is set in stone, as it's a result of the physiological limit on how rapidly EODs can be produced. The upper limit is more arbitrary, being primarily a result of the preferred resting durations of the species. There is also a single phoneme, the cessation, that's around 105 milliseconds. Between 85 and 105 isn't used for talking. The range from 9 to 80 is divided into 3 sub-ranges. The scallop range from 9 to 10 milliseconds, the buzz range from 10 to 60, and the hum range from 60 to 80. Again, these are typical numbers and can vary between speakers, but they aren't arbitrary either. Like in other Mormyrids, they appear to correspond to populations of high-pass, bandpass, and low-pass neurons in the exterior lateral nucleus. Like the cessation range, the scallop range only contains a single phoneme, the scallop. The buzz and hum ranges are further divided, the buzz range being divided into 7, denoted with dotted tone letters, and the hum range into 5, denoted with normal bar tone letters. The typical durations for these are shown in this table. A quick word on the orthography. It might seem weird to use the high tone letters to denote longer durations. That's done entirely to match the look of the graphs, like the ones I showed of SPICE earlier, where the x-axis is a timeline and the y-axis is the durations of IDIs. These durations are baselines. Each syllable in Medjedic has a baseline duration that any idiophoneme in it is relative to, with the exceptions of cessations and scallops. For each baseline, in addition to the baseline duration itself, there are 4 phonemes that are shorter than it, and another 4 that are longer than it. So 9 phonemes per baseline, plus the cessation and the scallop, for a total of 110 idiophonemes. Note that the percentages for the hum and buzz ranges aren't the same, and yes, some of them do in fact overlap. And now, it's time for the obligatory part of the video, where the presenter lists all the phonemes of the language. The list will start with a short sine wave signal, so that the first phoneme has something to be relative to. The first phoneme starts when the sine wave ends. YouTube still doesn't have a way to transmit extremely small shocks to your viewers. Also, you don't have electroreceptors. We will just have to settle for turning the electrical signal into audio so you can actually perceive it. Keep in mind that the audio is not the actual language. Medjedic's idiophonemes are Now, if there always needs to be a phoneme preceding the current one, how do you start talking? Which is a good question. And yes, this is a segue. The solution to this problem is the other type of phoneme in Medjedic, echoes. Mormyrids display a behavior called echoing, where they will emit their own EOD in response to the EOD of another fish at some defined amount of time after it, literally echoing it. Often the other fish will do the same, causing the two to sync up. This behavior is common when fish meet or start interacting. In fact, that's still how Medjed greet each other and signal that they wish to communicate. But I'm getting ahead of myself. With one exception, echophonemes don't have a specific duration like Idios, that one exception being the shortest one, which always has a latency of 2 milliseconds. For the rest, it depends on the rate at which the listener is firing EODs. Since EODs are also used to navigate, being silent and not talking isn't the same thing. When actively listening, a fish will adopt a consistent rate, if it's being polite at least, typically around once every 60 milliseconds. But since it can be different, the durations of echoes are their phase angle. So 0 degrees would be at the same time, 90 degrees is a quarter of the listener's IDI, and 180 degrees is halfway, causing the listener to also echo the speaker. Medjedic's echophonemes have phase angles up to 180 degrees. The lower limit is going to depend on the IDI of the listener. It's whatever equals 2 milliseconds. 180 degrees is denoted with a capital E for echo, and 2 milliseconds as capital J for jam. The in-between durations are written as phase angles in brackets. So, two things. Firstly, yes, the existence of echophonemes means that it's impossible to talk if you don't have someone to talk to, and that you can silence someone by simply being silent yourself. Secondly, I should explain the 2 milliseconds thing, and why it's J for jam. The sensory inputs from the 3 kinds of electroreceptors aren't processed in the same way or same part of the brain. After all, they serve different functions. When the command nucleus fires an EOD, a copy of that signal is sent to other parts of the brain involved in processing electroreceptor signals, a so-called corollary discharge. You find these in a lot of other places too. They basically make sure that the brain knows what else it's doing so that it can coordinate. For example, a corollary discharge is responsible for your brain knowing that when it tells your eye muscles to move, that the movement of your field of vision is your eyeballs and not the whole world suddenly jerking to the left. Since Conlang organ inputs are specifically for communicating with other fish, you don't want to respond to your own EOD. So, the corollary discharge temporarily blocks signals from Conlang organs from being processed during and right after a fish produced an EOD. In swordfish, that period lasts around 2 milliseconds after the EOD. In other words, the 2 millisecond minimum is so that the listener can perceive the EOD with the brain bits used for communication. And it's a J for jam because it's close to jamming the communication. This does of course bring up a secret third thing. What happens when an idiophoneme happens to line up with this period of blindness? After all, the listener is constantly producing EODs too. The answer is corollary discharge avoidance allophones. Medjedic speakers learn to suddenly adjust the durations of IDIs when their EODs would clash with the listener's. If the speaker's EOD would start during the 2 millisecond period after the listener's ends, the idio is lengthened so that the peak of the first phase happens at the 2 millisecond mark. Likewise, if the speaker's EOD would start during the listener's EOD, it's shortened so that the first peak coincides with the start of the listener's EOD. In both cases, if the overlap between the speaker's EOD and the inhibited period of the listener is already smaller than what the allophony would result in, no adjustment is made. These half-perceived EODs signals the adjustment to the listener. Scallops and shorter than baseline extra short boss phonemes are always lengthened. Obviously, this isn't a perfect system, but it's good enough to compensate adequately. Medjedic doesn't have much allophony beyond that. The only other one is that cessations get shortened to a baseline very long, buzz idio, when word final. The phonotactics are very simple. With 3 exceptions, all syllables have the following structure, where E is echo, I is any non-scallop, non-cessation idio, 0 is a baseline idio, exclamation point is a scallop idio, and caret is a cessation idio. The most important takeaways here are that all syllables with any idios must contain at least one baseline idio, that scallops and cessations can only occur syllable initial and syllable final respectively, and finally that echoes can only appear syllable initial. They can also only appear word initial, and in fact must do so. The 3 exceptions to this structure are the words for yes, no, and maybe, which are expressed via regularizations rather than phase expires. All normal Medjedic words have the same structure, and all represent an entity of some kind. Each word is a description of that entity via its associations with the noun morphemes in it. You have a pronoun-like first syllable, followed by one or more noun and verb pairs. The first syllable acts like the subject in a sentence with each noun-verb pair, the nouns being the objects of the sentence. One thing you will see as we go through this structure is a strong morphosemantic association between shorter IDIs and realness. The shorter the baseline IDI is, the more real, actual, specific, or closer to the speaker a morpheme is. The first syllable, which is effectively a pronoun, gets inflected for the case, fluviality, location, and sometimes the person of the entity it's describing. Fluviality is basically how much the entity is interacting with the river. A fluvial entity is one that's being carried by the river. A semi-fluvial entity isn't being carried by the river, but extends along it or otherwise following its course in some way. Finally, a non-fluvial entity might still be in the river, but it's not being carried by it, nor following its flow in any way. Case is marked by the baseline duration of the first syllable. The cases of fluvial entities are marked using hum baselines, while non-fluvial and semi-fluvial entities have their cases marked with buzz baselines. Medjedic's cases are nominative, nominative genitive, accusative, accusative genitive, locative, and temporal. For fluvial entities, the temporal and locative case is combined. For them, time and location is inherently linked, since they're moving down the river. In the genitive cases, the pronoun refers to the possessor, but the entity being described is the possessed. For entities that aren't people, the first syllable also marks distance, as it relates to the ranges of electrolocation and electrocommunication. When phase angles are used, smaller angles means nearer to the speaker. For semi-fluvial entities, the distance is to the closest part of them. While the electrolocation range of one fish is limited to one body length, multiple fish can cooperate and use each other's EODs to extend the range. So exactly where the edge of the range is varies. You'll notice that all the plural present pronouns are combined into one. The reason should hopefully be obvious. You can only talk directly to one person at a time. When you use this pronoun, you can specify who you're talking to by describing them. The first syllable also marks location on the river for fluvial and semi-fluvial entities. For objects that extend up or down the river, this indicates where they end. If they extend past here, the end upriver is given priority. Since the range of electrocommunication is so short, it's common for Medjed to pass on messages from someone else. This is indicated by adding a CC to the end of the first syllable. Finally, if the speaker is unsure of the entity's location, a cessation idio can also be added at the end. All noun roots in Medjedic must have at least one variable syllable. That is, a syllable that changing the baseline of changes the meaning of the root. The meanings are related, with the shortest baseline root being the most concrete and tangibles of the meanings, and the longer ones having meanings that are less specific or more abstract. So for example, the root with an extra short baseline means speech, as in the product of talking, while the very short baseline version means word, the short baseline Medjedic, and the long baseline language in general. When part of a full word, the variable syllable being in the buzz range marks that the entity is in the river, while the hum range marks it as not being in the water. Since there are less hum baselines than boss ones, the two shortest and two longest boss baselines get collapsed into the short and long hum baselines, which is fine. Things above the water are of less concern to fish. Compound nouns are made by adding the syllable C0 in between the roots. The baseline is very short hum for entities above water and extra long buzz for those below the surface. A scallop idio can be added to the first syllable of a root to add emphasis, signaling some kind of importance. A cessation idio can be added to the last syllable of the root if the speaker is unsure that it's correct. Nouns are inflected for number, or amount for mass nouns. The baseline of this suffix is the same as the last syllable of the root. Again, a cessation idio can be added if the speaker is unsure of the correctness of the number. Medjedic has verbs. They are just kind of shy. It's less that each word has a noun-verb pair, and more that they have pairs of nouns and the tam inflections of a null verb, meaning to associate with. Each noun is followed by 3 syllables, the baseline duration of which marks the association between the noun and the entity being referred to by the whole word in the past, in the present, and in the future. The order of them depends on the fluviality of the word. For semi- and non-fluvial entities, the order is past, present, future. For fluvial entities, it's future, present, past. Because which way your future lies depends on if you're being carried by the river or not. The shorter the baseline duration, the more association there is, was, or will be between the noun and the entity being described at that time. From fully being its identity, to a property it has, to its location, to having no association with it at all. The exact meanings of the durations being context dependent. This basically gives you a set of small timelines for different aspects of the entity that the word represents. If all 3 syllables are the same, they get combined into one syllable with a scallop added to it. Quick note, I'm going to play Medjedic words and phrases for you. The EODs of the listener will be lower volume than the speakers. Not because the listeners actually have a lower amplitude, but rather because the recordings were done near the speaker. Remember, the range is really short, so the amplitude drops off fast. For an example of how the verb syllables work, the following all use the noun morpheme meaning love, but mean different things. Once again, each syllable can have a cessation idio added to it if the speaker is unsure or asking a question. Buzz baselines mark realis mood, while hum baselines mark irrealis moods. Medjedic has 2 irrealis moods. Desiderative, which is unmarked, and necessitative, which is marked as shown in the table. Conditionals are formed by using irrealis moods in words that's in the locative or temporal case. The order of the noun-verb pairs in a word is from most to least associated. The word order of Medjedic is both fixed and pretty flexible. Fundamentally, it's SOV, but since the verb is always null, it's really more SO. Genitives follow their processor, and locative and temporal words go at the end of a sentence, with locative coming before temporal. But since each word always contains a pronoun, any of them can be dropped, and often are, if they aren't required for context. If I want to say that your fish is cute, I don't need to describe you, I can simply refer to you as the possessor and just describe the fish. Okay, but how do you actually say things? Subject and agent and object and patient are essentially always the same. Like you would expect, the subject is the cause of some change of state. If it's a change to itself, then you just need the subject. If it's a change to another entity, well, that's the object. There just isn't a verb describing the action causing the change. Instead, the action is inferred from what properties changed in both subject and object, and from which other properties the speaker thought were relevant to include. Take for example this sentence, meaning I tricked conlangers into learning about fish. The verbs trick and learn are implied by the context. The change of state was caused by a trick, and gaining more knowledge is what learning is. Thanks for coming to my Medjed talk. I will leave you with an excerpt from a classic Medjedian myth about time.